It kind of goes without saying that you need tools in order to manage a garden and grow vegetables, and there's a huge diversity of different types of tools that can be used. These tools can be as basic as a sharp stick that is used to dig a hole in the ground in order to plant a seed, or they can be highly engineered in order to make specific tasks much easier and faster. Within my vegetable gardens, I tend to do everything manually and have avoided using machinery for establishing the gardens and managing the soil, so I rely on hand tools quite a bit. And over the years, a few of these tools have definitely become my favorites, both for establishing and managing the gardens and for helping out in this Red Gardens project. The conventional tool that I use the most when working in the gardens is probably a square head spade, on which I replace the short handle with a long one. It's a rough and rugged tool, and I use it for a lot of the work that I do, digging the soil and shoveling material. But the reason that I like the long-handled square spade so much is that it can be such a versatile tool, but only if it's sharp. I use a file to try to keep a reasonably sharp edge on this forge-tempered steel, but this requires regular sharpening because of all the stones that are in the soil that I have to work with. Depending on the type of work, I can sharpen it quite often, and the oldest spade head that I have has been filed so much that it is quite a bit shorter than it originally was. But the sharper it is, the easier it is to cut through turf or grasses, and to chop up material for the compost. With a bit of force, it can even chop through the tough stalks and roots of large brassica plants. It's also useful for chopping in green manures, and the long handle makes it more comfortable tackling a large patch of stinging nettles. It's my main tool for edging gardens, digging out weeds and stones in paths, and for chop and dropping weeds in some of the gardens. The sharp edge is handy for cutting off the tops and roots of swede or rutabaga plants, and I've used a sharp edge to harvest the head of broccoli or cauliflower, and even cut rope or twine when I forgot my knife. It's probably the tool that has the most diverse range of uses. My traditional garden fork is a good companion to the spade, and as with the spade, I replace the short handle with a much longer one, which I find to be much more useful. While I might use a spade more when establishing and clearing a garden, I mainly use a fork for digging over and loosening the soil, breaking up clumps, and general ongoing management of the soil, at least in the gardens that I'm still digging the soil. The strong tines of the forged steel and the long handle allows me to put in a lot of force to help ease larger rocks out from the soil, though I have snapped a few handles doing this over the years. I've also found that it can be a suitable substitute for a rake, especially for small areas. Working the flat part of the tines across the soil in a back and forth motion can level the bed quite well, and can develop a decent seed bed with a bit of work. Dragging the points of the tines along the bed is useful for breaking up the surface and shallowly working in compost and other fertility amendments, and dragging them in a line can make a decent furrow for sowing seeds. The long-handled fork is the main tool that I use for turning compost and moving straw and other rough materials. It's also the tool that I will typically use for digging out potatoes, as well as loosening carrots, parsnip, and leeks when harvesting. It is handy for digging out perennial weed roots, and I occasionally use one of the tines to gently loosen the soil around a weed that I want to pull out, holding it in one hand so that it feels quite balanced. In all these cases, there are better and more efficient tools for the job, but in a small garden it's often easier to simply use the tool that is closest and most versatile. As a good example, the long handle of the fork stuck in the ground makes a handy place to wrap a grip for my smartphone when I'm filming in the gardens. My third favorite tool is a wire weeder that I made, and it is the most recently added tool to this list. I had seen a wire weeder tool used by a couple of market gardeners, and it reminded me of an idea that I had read somewhere about the possibility of making a simple handheld weeder by hammering a wire flat. I tried it out, and it quickly became one of my favorite tools. It's not as versatile as a spade or a fork, as it's really only useful for removing tiny weeds and for light surface cultivation, but they are really easy to make from inexpensive material that I have lots of. I'm still experimenting with them and trying out different shapes and sizes, and will likely end up with quite a few of them available for use around different parts of the gardens. The first one I made was designed for more vertical use, with a flat section orientated perpendicular to the handle. I found it to be especially useful for clearing out young weeds in rows between seedlings, and also easy to manipulate between larger onion plants. Another version was hammered flat in line with the handle, and is more useful for weeding around and under leafy plants like lettuce and spinach. This one is also quite handy when weeding beds that have drip line watering systems, as it is shaped so that it can easily slide horizontally underneath the pipes. I can easily bend or adapt these tools, or I can attach one to a long handle for easier use, or I can make a new one to better fit a particular situation in the gardens. It is a simple tool that is not so versatile or rugged, but it is adaptable and very cheap and easy to make, and not such a hassle when I break a handle. If I could only have 3 tools to manage a vegetable garden with, I think I would pick a sharp spade, a long-handled fork, and a simple wire weeder. The 4th tool that I would add to this list is a fold-up carpenter's ruler. It's perhaps a lot less necessary in a typical garden, but I've found it very useful for the research component of this Red Gardens project. Because of the nature of this project, I try to maintain a reasonable amount of accuracy with bed sizes, planting distances, and row spaces, as this makes it easier to compare the different gardens and to replicate the plantings from one season to the next. This reduces some of the variables that could come with estimations and less accurate plantings. And being able to easily lay out and measure everything definitely suits the detail and data-oriented part of this project, and it also satisfies the architect within me. The fold-up nature of this tool means that it's much more likely to be on hand, and it's stiff enough to stretch out and hold its own weight. And it also helps in setting out relatively straight lines in the smaller scale of these gardens. I also use it to compare the growth of plants in different gardens as a tool to help me make more accurate observations, and it makes a good visual scale when taking photographs. I've had this particular ruler for years now, and although one section broke off, it's still really useful. The 5th choice on my list of my favorite tools in the vegetable garden is actually my smartphone. Although it isn't a tool in the traditional sense that the others are, I think of it as a tool for my brain. Most gardeners, growers, and farmers have some method for keeping track of planting plans, recording what happened when, and making a list of everything that needs to be done. With this project, I have at least 7 different growing spaces with multiple crops, with way too many details to keep track of in my head, and a lot of harvesting data to record. This is where the technology of the smartphone comes in really handy, where all of my plans and records and everything that happens in the gardens are entered into a spreadsheet or a digital notebook, and it is all automatically uploaded to my desktop computer at home via the cloud. I couldn't manage the abundance of information related to this project without this pocket-sized computer. I also use the same smartphone to take photographs to document things and to record videos. For the past few seasons, most of the footage and the videos on this channel were taken with a smartphone. The technology available in my pocket is really quite remarkable and versatile. I also use it to communicate with a lot of people and to do a lot of research online, whenever I'm trying to remember something that I read or to find out more about something that I observed in the gardens. Without a doubt, this is a tool that I use the most in my gardens. I find it interesting that these 5 tools cover such a broad range, from the simple and conventional to the highly complex and expensive. I think I'd be quite content to manage a small-scale vegetable garden using just these 5 tools, but of course I use a number of other ones on a regular basis. It is always handy to have a sharp utility knife around, and I prefer one that I can pull out or open with one hand. I use 2 different types of rakes to level and clean garden beds, and I use an oscillating hoe for a lot of the weeding in large areas. I use a cultivating hoe for a lot of things, including clearing rough ground, and a standard pointed shovel is my main tool for moving loose material like compost. I also have a traditional Austrian scythe for clearing areas and collecting materials to make compost with. And I quite like the soil blocker, which is one of the main methods that I use for growing seedlings for transplanting. I tend to use different types of tools in the different gardens, and the tools that I use depends on the stage of development of the gardens. More rugged tools tend to be used during the first few seasons, and more refined tools tend to be more used as the soil develops and the weeds get under control. This list will no doubt change over time as I discover new tools and change the methods that I use. And of course, as I developed a larger scale of the black plot, a wide range of tools more appropriate for market gardening become useful. In a few years, I may have a completely different set of tools that I prefer to use when growing vegetables.